Thanks for tuning into the Dinosaurs Lately podcast, the dinosaur podcast that features periodic updates recapping the latest news on the dinosaurs.
They came from so far away.
My name is Ryan Rogers, and this is the podcast that targets a type of dinosaur, tries to catch you up on everything that's been published on them lately. This is the first of these interstitial episodes I've created. The goal is to keep up with all the dinosaurs news, even when I'm not publishing new episodes of the Juras-Sick Park-Cast. If you're interested in this sort of thing, I hope it helps you feel more up to date. Welcome to episode 1, Abelisauroids, in the summer of 2025, recorded on July 22nd, 2025. A continued thank you to Christoph Oakes of Snail, S-N-A-L-E. Check out his incredible albums on Spotify and Bandcamp. Today's intro is The Day of the Incredible Monster from the Center of the Earth, and the outro is Sacrifice to the Inhuman Creature from Snails, self-titled the debut album, Snail. So this episode we're catching up on Abelisauroids. What's new that's been learned in the past year on Abelisaurids. The first news article is a new abelisaurid dinosaur from the end Cretaceous of Patagonia and the evolutionary rates among the Ceratosauria from May 2024. Towards the end Cretaceous extinction event, the abelisaurids are described in this paper as, quote, arguably the most successful groups of carnivorous dinosaurs from Gondwana in the Cretaceous, reaching their highest diversity towards the end of this period. Paleoecologists like to interpret high biodiversity as a success criterion, and the higher it is, the greater their argument for the adaptability and resilience of a species. In other words, the Gondwanan abelisaurs are thriving in the southern hemisphere in the late Cretaceous. The authors report over time in the late Cretaceous, specifically during the Cenomanian-Turonian interval, theropod species like the Carcharodontosaurids and Spinosaurids disappeared, and abelisaurids and megaraptorans became the predominant lineages. So when you're out there wondering what beats a Giganotosaurus or Spinosaurus, the answer isn't Tyrannosaurus, it's actually Abelisaurs and Megaraptorans, but that's a story for another day. More accurately, Abelisaurs and Megaraptorans were better adapted and more resilient, dominating the ecological niches once filled by the Carcharodontosaurs and Spinosaurs. After that faunal turnover, Abelisaurs, quote, were the most abundant theropods during the late Cretaceous, occurring in all Gondwanan regions except Antarctica and Australia, where they remain unknown. They are known principally from South America, which has the best fossil record for this group, as well as from India, North Africa, and Madagascar. Incomplete abelisaurid specimens were also discovered in Europe, adding evidence to the biogeographical link between southern Europe and Gondwana. The authors continue to say recent phylogenetic analyses typically agree that there are two principal clades within Abelisauridae, the Majungasaurines and the Brachyrostrum. The clade recognized as Majungasaurine mainly includes the Indian and Malagasy forms, whereas Brachyrostrum includes mainly, if not only, South American abelisaurids. The Majungasaurs are mid-sized bipedal predators interpreted to be relatively slow-moving, with long legs built for striding, not running. Their tall, deep heads had powerful jaws, and they're known for their thick and often horned skulls and vestigial arms. The Brachyrostrons, on the other hand, had very short, narrow skulls and extremely reduced forearms, even more so than other abelisaurids. Many had horns or rugosities on the frontal and nasal bones, which may have been dermal armor, and they're known from South America and were lightly built compared to other large theropods, ranging from like 20 to 26 feet in length and perhaps 1.5 to maybe 2.5 tons in weight. These forms appear to have differentiated thanks to their geography. Before we go much further, if you're having trouble picturing an abelisaur, know that they derive from ceratosaurs, who were known to have had that high, pointy ridge over their eyes, and especially the famous big horn on the front of their snout. The abelisaurs carried that distinct and pointy skull feature and continued to adapt and contort into interesting and protruding shapes, resulting in strong processes pointing up above the eyes and short-faced snouts. And most fascinating were their tremendously reduced forelimbs, which basically made them look like they had the arms of a salamander, obviously on the size of a dinosaur. The rest of the figure was a slim, lengthy torso and lengthy legs, which really made them appear something like a shark with legs. And a new highly derived species of the South American Brachyrostrum type of abelisaur is named in this paper. It's Coelacanth inacayale. With respect to the indigenous peoples of Argentina, Coelacanth is the Tucian word for from clay and water, and inacayale honors Inacayal, one of the last chiefs of the Tehuti people. So its name honors Chief Inacayale from the clay and water. This animal may have been about 13 feet long, but a microscopic examination of its bone structure suggests it wasn't fully grown when it died. That said, it's so similar to Carnotaurus, it might be a juvenile Carnotaur, but the authors say that the differences in the skull, vertebrae, and hind limbs are unlikely to have changed so dramatically during growth, which strengthens their interpretation that this is a new, distinct species. Coelacanth is from the latest late Cretaceous, the Maastrichtian age, and is known by its holotype MPEF-PV 10826, housed at the Museo Paleontologico Egidio Ferrulio. It was uncovered from the La Colonia Formation. It's comprised of closely associated but disarticulated remains of the skull and atlas and complete sacrum, 8 caudal vertebrae, and an almost complete pelvis and hind limbs. The La Colonia Formation has been interpreted to be a depositional environment that may have been a fluvial, estuarine tidal flat, or a coastal plain, or upper tidal flat. Another interpretation was that it was a coastal plain bathed by shallow seas, which developed a barrier island or a complex of lagoons or something like that, resulting in a brackish estuary or something like that. And if you allow me to speak freely, over the course of 6 million years, hey, maybe it was a bit of all those things over a period of time. There's plenty of time for all of these types of coastal changes to have come and gone. 6 million years. Finally, it's described as a highly derived type of brachyrostran abelisaur, which is called Juras-Sauria. These are known for having stiff backs and are distinguished by having tips and knobs on their face and head, as well as no fenestra between the frontal, postorbital, and lacrimal spaces in their head. Along with this new dinosaur, researchers have published 2 papers on abelisaur teeth and 1 paper on feeding strategies. The first paper, called Theropod Teeth from the Upper Cretaceous of Central Spain, Assessing the Paleogeographic History of European Abelisaurids, published in the journal Cretaceous Research in April 2025, ran a morphometric and cladistic analysis on isolated abelisaur teeth. The researchers had been excavating isolated abelisaur teeth from the Upper Campanian Lower Maastrichtian site of Poyos in Guadalajara, Spain, and the sample included 20 relatively complete and well-preserved tooth crowns belonging to mesial and lateral teeth. They concluded that the teeth belonged to a medium-sized abelisaur, which closely resembled the acrovenator, which I'm going to admit I'd not heard of until just when I started reading about this. It's a French majungasaur described in 2014. As described earlier, the 2 types of abelisaurs are geographically divided. The majungasaurs in India, Madagascar, and I guess in a bit of Europe, like Spain and France, whereas the brachyrostran abelisaurs are from South America. These specimens in Spain and France continue to support that observation. Identifying these isolated teeth expands the known geographic range of majungasaurs into Spain and the Iberian Peninsula in the latest Campanian age, says the paper. This paper also asserts that abelisaurs aren't just especially successful in Gondwana, but, quote, abelisaurids were one of the most abundant groups of non-Silurisaurian theropods in the Upper Cretaceous of Europe, and possibly the only medium to large-sized carnivorous dinosaurs in the Ibero-Amorican realm from the Upper Cenomanian to the Upper Maastrichtian. The authors elaborate the increasing abundance of abelisaurids during the late Cretaceous and the vanishing of other large theropods that dominated the early Cretaceous faunas of Ibero-America seem to be part of a faunistic turnover that can be related to a climate change to semi-arid conditions. What's emerging as a theme in abelisaur literature is that they were dominant and had longevity in their ecosystems, and their ecosystems are continuing to be described as arid or semi-arid. Another paper published in the Journal of Vertebrate Paleontology in May 2024 is named Overabundance of Abelisaurid Teeth in the Açu Formation, Albian-Cenomanian, Potiguar Basin, Northeastern Brazil, morphometric, cladistic, and machine learning approaches. These researchers were working on Brazilian abelisaurs, which we know means that they are the brachyrostran style, and they had 43 new isolated theropod teeth from this unit through phylogenetic, linear discriminant, and machine learning analyses. Quote, the Açu Formation, Albian-Cenomanian, Potiguar Basin, Northeastern Brazil, has yielded a great variety of fossil terrestrial vertebrates, with theropod dinosaurs standing out as one of the most diverse among them, and a large part of this diversity being known only by isolated teeth. The researchers photographed each specimen with an Axiocam 208TM color digital camera attached to a Zeiss STEMI 2000 CTM stereoscopic binocular microscope using the Zen Light 3.2 software. The measurements were digitally taken with the free software ImageJ. These researchers, quote, developed an app, Dino Toothier, in which the data can be tested solely by uploading tooth measurements into a file in order to facilitate and democratize usage of the machine learning models. And that app is accessible online. You just go and click on it and upload your tooth. Based on the machine learning model, it will tell you what you want to know about that tooth. From the 43 teeth that they ran through their app, they revealed the first Noasaurid found in the Açu Formation, and, quote, also an unexpectedly high occurrence of abelisaurid specimens for a mid-Cretaceous unit in western Gondwana, with 4 morphotypes related to different positions along the tooth row. We know that there's already a high diversity of Abelisauros in Gondwana, which are said to be mid-sized carnivores, but what surprised the researchers is that the representation of Carcharodontosaurs, or large carnivores, was low. Their theory is that a lack of large sauropods in the unit may have hindered the presence of large theropods. In other words, if Carcharodontosaurs were sauropod specialists, no sauropods meant no Carcharodontosaurs, according to their study. So, 2 stories on teeth, but how were these teeth being used? The next paper is, quote, the next paper is Morphology of the Maxilla informs about the type of predation strategy and the evolution of Abelisauridae, from March 2025, where the researchers tested the hypothesis that late Cretaceous abelisaurs were specialized hunters. They considered the shape of the abelisaur's jaws and the, quote, diversity and disparity of the abelisaurid maxilla in a macroevolutionary context by quantifying the, quote, maxillary shape in 17 taxa using 2D geometric morphometrics and analyzed different evolutionary scenarios and trends with phylogenetic comparative methods. That's a mouthful. Their research suggests that the hunter specialization appeared during the early Cretaceous, revealing that Cretaceous abelisaurids can be considered specialist hunters. Or in other words, the high levels of morphological disparity in the maxilla occurred shortly after the Cenomanian-Turonian faunistic turnover, which involved drastic changes in the South American terrestrial faunal assemblages. So, when the ecology of the environment changed, the jaw shapes changed, which suggests that there was a, quote, shift in the ecological pressures or socio-sexual mechanisms, which were the main drivers of the evolution. So, as Ceratosaurs in the Jurassic, which were considered generalist hunters, further evolved into the Gondwanan abelisaurids, the changes in the shape of their snouts suggests the abelisaurid family evolved into specialized predators. The authors hope more osteological elements of the abelisaurid skull and their postcranial skeleton will be analyzed under a quantitative macroevolutionary framework to further test their observations. And our next paper dates back a few million years to the mid-Cretaceous, and it's called Beyond Stromer's Riddle, the Impact of Lumping and Splitting Hypotheses on the Systematics of the Giant Predatory Dinosaurs from Northern Africa in the Italian Journal of Geosciences from May 2025. During the mid-Cretaceous, before abelisaurids came to dominate the Gondwanan supercontinent, there were a triumvirate of clades in Northern Africa, the Abelisauroidea, the Albisauridae, and the Spinosauridae. We're fairly familiar with allosaurs and spinosaurs, and hopefully we are presently, according to this episode, very familiar with abelisaurs too. Abelisauroidea will be the more basal, older forms of abelisaurs before their specialization in the late Cretaceous. Think of Abelisauroidea as forms that are more closely related to the Ceratosaur family form, which they are believed to have evolved from, than the derived carnivores you picture with those big bull horns over their eyes. The mid-Cretaceous North African remains of this triumvirate are mostly, quote, based on unassociated bones and have ignited debate on the validity and inclusiveness of the named species between lumping and splitting approaches, say the authors. And perhaps you've heard about the problems of the Spinosaur materials being very sparse, and its overall description is ever evolving as new bits and pieces are discovered. These constant updates to its appearance are thanks to the unassociated bones and the scraps of fossils that are being used to describe Spinosaur specimens. The authors in this paper used some new theropod material from the Chem beds in Morocco to test the, quote, methodological splitting approach on theropod phylogenetics and revised the, quote, theropod material from the Açu Formation in Egypt that was described by Ernst Stromer in 1934. Their review led them to consider Deltadromeus a junior synonym of Bahraisaurus. Now, because we're talking Abelisauroidea, and it's basically at the very earliest split from the Ceratosaurs, this means it includes some species which went on in a distinct other family trees, but are in the Abelisauroid realm, but not necessarily the Abelisaur realm. These are closely related cousins of Abelisaurs. Frankly, these familial relationships are still in flux. However, they are Abelisaur adjacent, and so I'm including them today in this episode because I don't know when I'll ever get back to talk about these families. Among the Abelisauroids are, of course, the Abelisaurids, but also the Noasaurids. The Noasaurid skulls were more traditional theropod shapes than the Abelisaurs. They had sharp teeth that splayed outwards from a downturned lower jaw and had longer arms than Abelisaurs. They were nimble, lightly built, and their legs and feet show adaptations for running. They almost look like ornithomimosaurs, which you'll recall as the Gallimimus from Jurassic Park. The Noasaurus' diet is difficult to determine, but hypotheses range from fish to insects. I've seen fruit suggested, and other small animals. More derived Noasaurs, called Elaphrosaurs, were actually beaked and toothless and herbivorous. So basal Noasaurs may have had vegetarian proclivities, maybe. Referring back to the subject of this paper, Behariosaurus and Deltadromeus are among those types of specimens that are very fragmentary. And in the case of Behariosaurus, its fossils were destroyed during the Second World War. So they're literally been considered to be these two animals, either abelisauroids. They've been interpreted as allosaurs, as ceratosaurs, even as a tyrannosauroid, because their remains are just so open to interpretation. In this paper, the authors suggest that Deltadromeus and Behariosaurus can be referred to the same type of animal. Quote, the revision of the Theropod material from the Albian-Cenomanian of North Africa and the application of methodological splitting in an updated large-scale phylogenetic analysis of Theropoda support the synonymy between the Moroccan Deltadromeus and the Egyptian Behariosaurus. What's more, they've classified the Behariosaurus and Deltadromeus, which had previously been considered predatory dinosaurs, as probably omnivorous, if not vegetarian. Yes, their phylogenetic bracketing puts Behariosaurus, once interpreted as a gigantic predator, as a cousin to Lemusaurus, which is an emu-sized herbivore, making Behariosaurus a very, very big herbivore. This addressed Stromer's riddle, as the title of this paper suggests, because Stromer was uncovering huge carnivores like the 40-foot Spinosaurus, the 35-foot Behariosaurus, and the 40-foot Carcharodontosaurus, back before the Second World War, but no herbivores, and it begged the question, what were all these huge predators eating? This paper, quote, addresses the riddle as they report, while Spinosaurs were eating fish, and Behariosaurus is probably a herbivore, so perhaps that's the answer to the riddle. There weren't all these different giant carnivores, because two of them weren't eating dinosaurs and meat and stuff like that. They're eating fish and vegetables, which is good for you. The next paper discusses Noasaurid dietary habits, and it's called Osteology, Relationship, and Feeding Ecology of the Theropod dinosaur Noasaurus Lately from the late Cretaceous of northwestern Argentina, from the Zoological Journal of the Linnean Society from December 2024. This paper's research says that a radiation of late Cretaceous small-bodied Noasaurids restricted to the southern hemisphere share a, quote, peculiar morphology of the lateral dentition and manual unguals, which suggests that, quote, Noasaurus was an opportunistic carnivore feeding on small prey items and a possible piscivore, gaffing fish with its specialized hand claws. Now, if you're like me and you could use a definition on the verb to gaff, a gaff is a handled hook for holding or lifting heavy fish, or a spear or a spearhead for taking fish or turtles, or a metal spur for a gamecock. You get the point. The claws were specialized in a way that would have been perfect for catching fish. So much so, it's reasonable to think that that's what they were using their hand claws for. Also, this southern lineage of Noasaurids that are described as small and carnivorous sounds different than the earlier mentioned Behariosaurus, which is a Noasaurid that's huge and now believed to be herbivorous. You'd be correct. That's a separate lineage of Noasaurids. So in the southern hemisphere of the late Cretaceous, Abelisaurids and Noasaurids, descendants of the Ceratosaurs in the Jurassic, have specialized their jaws and teeth, gaining longevity and prosperity across the Gondwanan continent. The Abelisaurs earlier were described only as a specialist hunter, but these Noasaurids are interpreted as opportunistic carnivores of small prey, likely including fish. And finally, to wrap up the latest on Abelisaurs, a new species of Noasaurid was named in May 2024 in the Proceedings of the Royal Society B, called the last ceratosaur of Asia, a new Noasaurid from the early Cretaceous Great Siberian Refugium. Named Kia cursor longipes, this Noasaurid was discovered in Siberia, was about 9 feet long, and given the name Kia after the Kia River, and cursor is Latin for runner. Longipes is Latin for long foot, making this the long-footed Kia River runner. The holotype KOK M5542, housed at the Cuzbas State Museum of Local Lore, was uncovered from the Açu Formation. It's comprised of a partial skeleton, including several vertebrae and limb bones, and possibly a partial neck vertebra. While Abelisauroids would go on to dominate the latest of the late Cretaceous, Kia cursor is a very basal member of the family from the Aptian age of the early Cretaceous, before these animals claimed the southern hemisphere. Ceratosaurs, the papers say, were unknown in Asia after the late Jurassic, so this Noasaurid is a surprise because it's, quote, 40 million years younger than the previous youngest record of ceratosaurs in Asia. This final piece of news I offer for perspective. It's not a published paper, and the author's identity is a mystery, so take this with a grain of salt. They offer a firm rebuttal with a synonymizing of Deltadromeus and Behariosaurus, and disagree that they are both Noasaurids. As was mentioned earlier in the paper, they're known online as the Paleo Freak, and their arguments are not peer-reviewed nor published, but I include the idea that, hey, a lot of what is published is based on sparse materials, and the margins for error are really high. I'm surprised to hear that Deltadromeus and Behariosaurus are considered Noasaurids. I'm even more surprised to hear that their findings encourage a herbivorous interpretation. That's very surprising. The Paleo Freak has a substantial argument against that interpretation. So I offer their perspective along with the truth about the latest news on dinosaurs, which is just because it's the latest news, it doesn't mean that it's agreed upon or that it's right. But that was quite a long discussion on things that have come up about Abelisaurs since, I guess, last year, 2024. And that brings us up to date. That's the latest on Abelisaurs. Thanks for tuning into Dinosaurs Lately. If you'd like to find links to the materials discussed on today's show, you can visit dinosaurslately.blogspot.com, which is a companion piece to the Dinosaurs Lately podcast. Dinosaurs Lately is a companion show to the Juras-Sick Park-Cast, the podcast where guests chat with me about Michael Crichton's 1990 novel Jurassic Park, and also Not That Too. If you'd like to be a guest on that show, you can reach me at ryansrogers@gmail.com. These podcasts are part of the Spring Chickens banner of amateur intellectual properties, including the Spring Chickens funny pages, Tomb of the Undead graphic novels, the Second Lapse graphic novelettes, the Infantry, and the worst of them all, the King Street Capers. And you can find links to all that baggage in the show notes or by visiting schickens.blogspot.com. And you can connect and follow on Facebook at facebook.com/springchickencapers, on YouTube by searching for the Juras-Sick Park-Cast podcast, on Tumblr at Mr. Rogers22, on X at RogersRyan22, or on Blue Sky at RogersRyan22.bisky.social. Thanks for tuning in. I hope you feel like you're all caught up on Abelisauroids for now. Until next time.